Hello, hi, good afternoon, and good morning to all of you guys. And thanks so much for joining today's Retalk virtual session. Retalk Australia, energy storage in Australia, market of gigawatt appetite. My name is Honam, and the event producer of Leader Associates, and your host of today's talk. As at the end of 2019, a total of 11.1 gigawatts of new renewable energy generation was under construction or financially committed in Australia, representing 20.5 billion in investment. As we are really excited about the huge potential of the renewable energy in this country, energy storage rises as a really unbreakable part to complete Australia's shift to a clean energy. Retalk Australia is a free online live webinar and networking platform produced by Leader Associates, aiming to bring our clients more Australia-focused energy storage contents and exclusive insights from the industry thought leaders during the COVID-19 outbreak. To start off, I'd like to briefly introduce who we are at Leader Associates, and most importantly, an overview of today's agenda and speaker. Leader Associates is a global leading event organizer in the field of clean energy. Although we are a young company founded in 2015, we've hosted more than 25 events across 5 continents, including Asia Pacific region, South America, Africa, and Europe. To date, we are very honored to have a network of over 80,000 industry professionals covering solar, wind, and energy storage. So basically, this is everything about us. After introducing the basic information about our company and the webinar, I would like to show you guys the agenda of today's webinar. As you can see in this slides, there will probably be 3 major sessions in this webinar, which will be presented by DP Energy, Clean Horizon, and Fluence respectively afterwards. Now, I'd like to give you guys an overview of our distinguished speaker at today's webinar. The first one is Ms. Catherine Wei. She's a country manager of Australia from DP Energy. The second speaker is Corentin Baschet. He's a head of market analysis from Clean Horizon. Clean Horizon is the sponsor of today's webinar. It helps energy storage players monetize energy storage by offering market analysis, business development, and technical consulting. Both the third and the fourth speakers are from Fluence. They will represent together in the last session. Mr. Stephen Gold is the regional marketing manager of APAC, and Mr. Achal Sondhi is the APAC market director. Finally, I'd like to provide some tips with our audience. If you have any technical issue, you can use the chat box at the bottom of your screen. With a question to the speaker, please use Q&A box next to the chat box. We'll go through all these questions during each session, and each presentation is followed by 10 minutes Q&A session. Please do not add any further questions or comments once the Q&A session gets started, because we really hope to create a more comfortable environment for our presenters to address the pre-asked questions. And the slides and the recording will be sent through email several days later after the webinar. Now, let me introduce our first speaker. The first speaker is Catherine Wei. Catherine is a specialist in renewable energy development. She brings a deep understanding of the complexion of Australian market to her role with DP Energy. With more than 15 years of renewable energy experience, she has worked in the mining sector for BHP Billiton. Hi, Catherine. It is your turn to start your presentation right now.
I will just try and find my... Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to get my presentation ready to share. I think that's worked. Okay, so thanks, Honam, and thank you for inviting me to speak today, and I hope you enjoy my presentation. So a bit about DP Energy, for those of you who haven't heard about the company. We've been a pioneer in the wind industry area as we started developing projects 25 plus years ago in Ireland. We're primarily a front-end developer and primarily focus on wind, although we also do hybrid projects, and we have some solar interests as well as some tidal interests in Europe. We originally, when we began our business, built, owned and operated projects when they were smaller. Nowadays, we're mostly on the front end, and we sell the projects when we get to a certain point. Excitingly, I wanted to let you know that our first project in Australia, the Port Augusta Renewable Energy Park, began site mobilisation and site establishment yesterday. So that's a great milestone for DP Energy in Australia, and we look forward to the rest of our pipeline of projects. Just for your interest, the Port Augusta project is now 100% owned by Iberdrola, but DP Energy is still involved in a supporting role. A little bit more about DP Energy. So this is a busy slide, but hopefully you can see it well enough. We're based in Ireland. We're a private company. We have a presence in UK, Canada and Australia. And we have a lot of interests in renewable energy. Basically, if it makes sense, then we'll do it. And we're even looking into some offshore wind in Ireland at the moment. And as I mentioned, the tidal interest as well. So the Port Augusta project I mentioned before is a hybrid project, and it was originally a wind project, and we added solar because it made sense. So today, we're not a technology provider, we're a technology user, a developer. So today I'm not talking about the technology per se, I'm talking about renewable energy and storage context in the policy environment we find ourselves in Australia. So I'll explore that during my talk, and hopefully give you some insights into where I think the market sits at the moment for renewable energy and storage. So my first point, coal is retiring in Australia. It's inevitable. If you look at the graph in the top right of your screen, that's from AEMO in the Integrated System Plan. And you can see, you know, the coal is coming offline because as it ages, as it gets to 50 years, that's when that graph has slated it should close. So it will happen, and it's just when. It might not happen exactly on those years, but it will be around that time. And financiers are saying they're not going to finance coal, so it's unlikely there'll be any new coal built in Australia unless it's underwritten by the government, and that is probably more unlikely as well. My second point, wind and solar energy are the cheapest form of new build energy in Australia now, and have been for the last few years. So that continues to be the case. Wind and battery is starting to become competitive with fossil fuel, as is solar and battery. So watch this space as battery prices continue to reduce. My third point, the renewable energy target is the market mechanism which has underpinned projects, renewable energy projects, up until the last few years. And that has sort of hit its peak now. So the large scale generation certificates have reached their, I guess, their underpinning of investment of projects now, and they're worth very little. My fourth point, there's flattening demand during the day due to distributed solar and also due to large scale utility solar. So most states are experiencing that, and it contributes obviously to lowering prices. The fifth point, there's technology advances in renewable energy, storage, enabling technologies, including digital technologies, and it's developing at a great rate. The bottom slide there is AEMO's, in the same integrated system plan, their projection of their sort of neutral case as to what's going to happen in the energy sector. And as you can see, it looks like the coal gradually gets replaced by storage, utility scale storage. So the grid of the future, what does it look like? So it needs to reduce carbon. It needs to include renewable energy and enabling technology, and storage is key in this environment. I've found it quite heartening that our market operator, the CEO, has recognised that future and has actually stated it publicly. So we do need to look forward. And she also acknowledges that the old spinning reserve that people have told us that you just have to have, you can't get away from it, you can't have lots of renewable energy because you need that old spinning reserve. She said it is replaceable, and I think that's quite heartening. I'm now going to go through policy at a federal level, and basically there's no carbon or energy policy at a federal level. There are a few discussion papers and from various entities, and I'll walk you through those, but basically there's no real sort of forward-looking policy that companies can be certain of into the future. So the Technology Investment Roadmap was released fairly recently by the federal government. It's a discussion paper. It doesn't give me a great deal of confidence in the way to the future. It does acknowledge renewable energy and storage, but only that there is a lot in development and they'll acknowledge it. There's a discussion around technologies that happened 14 years ago as well. It's like it's a bit of a back to the future paper in that in 2006 there was also talk of carbon capture and storage and nuclear for Australia, and both of those things have since been discounted, but they've raised themselves again in this paper, and it makes for a confusing debate. The Integrated System Plan, which is released by the market operator, AEMO, this is a forecast paper. It looks to the grid of the future, and it looks to what's needed in the next 20 years. It embraces the changes that is needed, and the future it looks to is a least cost future, and it lists the things that it believes will be part of that future. It lists a portfolio of renewable energy generation. It lists energy storage, distributed energy resources, flexible thermal capacity, and transmission. And then the last two papers I've put here, and by all means, this isn't all that's out in the public realm. I just thought that these 4 papers presented a bit of a dip into where the federal realm is in a policy sense. So the Energy Security Board, which is a product of the 3 big entities, the market operator, the market regulator, and the market rule maker, have released 2 papers recently. One's on system services and ahead markets, and again this is more a teaser discussion paper, and they're investigating mechanisms for the procurement of services in energy systems. So at the moment we have a generation market and a frequency control ancillary services market. This paper, I guess, will explore what other markets there could be or how to tweak the current markets. The moving to a 2-sided market is a forward-looking paper, and it is looking at giving consumers more of a role in the energy market to be able to interact with it. So all these papers are important mechanisms. There are important parts in all of them, but on their own, they don't lead to a comprehensive policy for the energy and carbon system into the future. So what could the future of federal policy be? Well, I can tell you what it won't be. So it won't be a NEG. So that's the National Energy Guarantee. This was a policy considered in 2018. It was a dual policy where it looked at changing rules to not accommodate, but push more dispatchable power into the grid, as well as implementing a carbon reduction policy. The fatal flaw, in my view, of the NEG was that the two mechanisms to both do the rule change and the carbon reduction were divorced from each other. One was something that needed to be agreed at the COAG Energy Council, and then it could become rules, and that was the changing the rules in the energy market to allow for more dispatchable generation. The one for carbon reduction had to go through both houses of Parliament, and it was unlikely ever to pass the Senate. So I thought there was great problems with the structure of that policy. Now, it won't also be, going back even further, it won't be a carbon trading scheme with a fixed price for the first year. So this was the mechanism that was actually introduced into Australia in 2012, and it ceased in 2014. And it was the carbon trading scheme that turned into a carbon tax and turned into a dirty word and was repealed by the coalition government in 2014. And it also won't be a CPRS. For those of you who remember back that far, in 2009, the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme was a carbon trading scheme, and it never got through the upper house. It was blocked by both the Greens and the coalition. Labor was introducing it. So it definitely won't be those things. I don't know when we might see some federal policy in this space, but if we do, I'm sure it will have a storage component. So going back to the slide I started with, in the absence of federal policy, what might we see in Australia? And I don't think it's doom and gloom at all, because business as usual presents quite a compelling market for investment in the nation for renewable energy and storage, I think. So I wanted, before I go through my list, I wanted to mention there is a notable exception in policy that is going to help, I think, battery storage in particular and renewable energy, and that's the 5-minute settlement rule, which should become in 3 months' time. And I believe that will quite change the way the market operates, and I guess we look with interest to see how that works, but it certainly supports the batteries to compete in the market. So going back to my first point, so in absence of federal policy, retiring coal, it's going to be disorderly, and renewable energy will be what gets built because it will replace it. So in absence of any other policy, that's what's going to happen. With my second point, renewable energy being the cheapest, wind and solar being the cheapest form of new build energy. So I think this will lead to more direct contracts between generators and corporates, as corporates look to reduce the price of their energy and have direct contracts rather than going through the traditional route of using a utility and having a retail contract. My third point, post renewable energy target and the large scale generation certificates diminishing in value. So you have to create value somewhere else, and that may include using batteries. And I've put the graph to the right there of your screen to show how we added value in our Port Augusta renewable energy project. So not all wind is the same, and this project shows the orange line, the average wind generation in summer for that project, and it's a daily cycle, and on average peaks around 6 to 7 p.m. Every evening. And that's, you know, that's the value. It's not a high wind site, but it is a time of day wind site that's more predictable than other locations, and its best resource happens in summer. So it's quite a different resource, and I think that's where developers are going to be looking into the future to create value. My fourth point about the flattening demand due to rooftop and utility solar, I think storage will be harnessed to flatten out that profile and push the generation or dispatch towards peak times. My fifth point, the technology advancements. I'm actually not sure what will happen here, but my gut feel is that those advancements without support in Australia may move offshore, and it may be that we buy them in Australia, which is what we seem to be doing with a lot of things nowadays. So that's my take on, I think, what will happen in absence of federal policy. I don't think it's bad. It's just business as usual. And interestingly, it has, well, I guess we're harking back to 2006 when this happened before, but states are going it alone. And this did happen 14 years ago when there was no strong federal policy in the renewable energy and carbon reduction space. States just harnessed it themselves. And so we're seeing in Victoria, for instance, their renewable energy target has been underpinned by reverse auctions. In Tasmania, they're looking to be the battery of the nation and having 200% renewable energy. South Australia are looking to net 100% renewable energy and have invested in large batteries. Queensland have a 50% target, and again, that's underpinned by reverse auctions. New South Wales are looking at the renewable energy zones to assist transmission infrastructure. My understanding of that is that the government will support connection to some of these renewable energy zones, and then perhaps there is an auction to get access to that infrastructure. I'm not exactly sure how that works. And the Australian Capital Territory has actually achieved their renewable energy of 100% by 2020 through their reverse auctions and through purchasing contracts throughout the NEM for their renewable energy supply. So in conclusion, I do think storage forms a large part of the solution for the grid of the future. The grid of the future will be a lot of renewable energy, which is intermittent in nature. There will be more hybrids, and storage will be part of that solution, whether it's behind the meter within an actual project or whether it's standalone storage, and whether it's storage that fulfills FCAS market or if it's arbitrage. Those things are, I guess, explored by some of our other speakers. I think in the absence of federal government policy, renewable energy and storage will continue. The grid of the future, as I said, requires renewable energy and storage. And if there is federal policy in the future, I'm sure it will also include storage. So thank you very much.
Okay, Catherine, thank you so much for your really impressive speech. Now, let's get to the really exciting Q&A session. In this session, Catherine will answer some questions that we collected before or during the live streaming. So right now, let's get to the Q&A session. So Catherine, the first question is there a pure market-based BESS project economically viable right now?
So my answer to that one is it depends. So it really depends where it is. So if you're in a constrained grid location, then absolutely it could be economic now. Actually, when talking about standalone batteries, aren't we? So if it's with renewable energy, I think it can be economic now. Standalone, I think it still probably needs some subsidy. And again, I will defer to those battery experts who are speaking after me, but my understanding is that it still will need some form of subsidy. But I do think its place at the moment is that it could be economic, accompanied with wind or solar in certain locations.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. So the second question is, what are the key barriers to the Australia storage market currently?
So in that one, I think there are a few barriers. So the price is one of them. So I still think it has a way to go to become economic, and maybe it's only a few years away. And I'm happy to be told what that is. I think education is one of the other things. I think batteries do a lot of different things, and it's difficult for people to understand what it would be that they want their battery to do, and how many hours, how big, how you know, do you interact with the FCAS market? Do you do it behind the meter for arbitrage? So I guess one of those barriers is it's very difficult to model what your revenue would be from a battery. And we've certainly found that in the Hornsdale battery case, and that was subsidised, but the Hornsdale battery in South Australia, they've found that, you know, that paid itself back in 2 years. But did they know that at the beginning? I'm not sure they did. And I think that contributes to the uncertainty of entrance for a battery. It is very hard to model what that future might look like. And I'm guessing that modelling is becoming more sophisticated, but it's still a bit of an uncertain future.
Okay. So the third question is energy storage implementation the requirement from utility already? And was the requirement taken into account in development?
Okay, so the first part of that question, again, the answer is it depends. So it's not a requirement per se. There's no utility who says you must implement storage, but you do have to undertake your generator performance standard studies to be able to connect to the grid. And it might be that undertaking those studies, you do need to add some kind of kit, and maybe that is a battery to help with certain aspects of your project to make sure that it's fulfills the rules for connection. So it may be that you need to. There's also system strength studies that need to be done now before you can connect to the grid, and it might be that a battery can fulfill increasing that system strength capability. Although I think synchronous condensers are the kit that's been put in for that lately. I guess when the second part of the question was this requirement taking into account in development. So as a developer, we are now adding batteries in our developments for planning approval, because we believe that at some stage there will be a requirement for batteries. So we're adding it, and the market's moving so quickly and changing so quickly that we're not quite sure what might be needed in the future. So we're putting it there in our projects, and if it's needed, it can be used, and if not, it doesn't need to be. So I think it has a future, and we're certainly considering it at the moment, but we haven't actually put it in a project yet.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. So there are actually some question which is raised in the live streaming question box that is probably some of our audience would you like to ask, would you like to answer? So there is a question from Raven. So the question is, hello, in Israel, solar plus storage tender concludes with a final price of 0.0578 kilowatt each per hour. So do you expect the further reduction of the price of solar plus storage and the wind plus storage set?
I'm not sure I quite understood that question. Is it under the Q&A or under the chat section?
Okay. So it's actually in the Q&A box. You can see.
Oh, there we go. I can see it there.
Yeah.
Thank you. Look, I expect that there will be, I mean, the modelling I've seen of the price of solar plus storage and wind plus storage, I mean, storage, it's combining them is new, and so I do believe that those prices will come down, and it might be a factor of the battery expertise. It's also a factor of the models and working out how they interact together, and also the studies that you do to get connections. So I think they will come down in price.
Okay. But anyway, thank you so much, Catherine. Thank you so much for your really impressive presentation and your answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so after the first presentation, I would like to introduce our second speaker, Corentin Baschet. He supports original sales team and helps customers identify applications that are attractive and also economical for energy storage development. As part of his responsibility, he works to educate potential customers and stakeholders on the benefit of energy storage. Hey, Corentin, please start your presentation.
Thanks, Holman. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. I'll try and share my screen. So I think I have to stop your screen sharing, Holman.
You can just directly share your screen, and then my screen sharing will end.
All right, so now you should see my screen. So thanks for hosting this presentation to Leader Associates and associating with us. I'll try and discuss within the 15 to 20 minutes I have what we understand of the Australian market for energy storage. But before I deep dive into that, I'd like to make a quick introduction of Clean Horizon. So Clean Horizon, we're a consulting company dedicated to energy storage since it was created back in 2009. And we have two activities. One is market analysis, and the other one is technical consulting. My role at Clean Horizon is that I'm the head of market analysis. So I'm supervising all of our products that are within this section. Two of them, which are on the shelf and very well known, are a monthly analysis notes on energy storage and a database of energy storage projects. And on the technical consulting side, we provide a range of services from sizing to administration of RFP and contract negotiations and selection with vendors. We are active throughout the world. We have opened last year an office in Miami to serve Latin America because we expect this segment to carry a lot of growth. Right, so during this presentation, I'll tackle, well, I've organized it around 3 items. One is what's the status of the energy storage market in Australia? And I'll talk about what Catherine said, and she did a great job at introducing the interest of storage for Australia. So I'll try and draw where it's at today and where it can be in a couple of years from now. Then I'll look at South Australia particularly, because you'll see it's a very specific market. And then I'll take you within 2 of the accessible revenues today for storage in Australia, meaning FCAS, so the revenues from ancillary services, and arbitrage on the energy markets. Right, so first, a bit of background on Australia. There are two big networks in Australia, which, and looking at a countryside, more than 53% of Australia's electricity generation based on output in years 2019 to 2020 was coal. So black coal was 53% and 70% was brown coal. So as you can see, it's quite heavily relying on fossil fuel for now. The western part of the grid is not interconnected with the eastern part of the grid. So there's both the national electricity market and the wholesale electricity market, where electricity is sold and purchased. Renewables have, of course, an increasing share. You see that wind already has a 10% share at a national level. and this is increasing as well as solar, with currently 3% of the generation. So that's a very generic introduction, but now going to storage and what's going on in storage. On the left-hand side of this graph, you can see the amount of large-scale projects operational today in each of the states of Australia. So so number one today for installation is South Australia, with 172 megawatts of battery storage systems operational. It's important to note here that I'm not including pumped hydro within these figures, and it's only large scale. So any project larger than 500 kilowatts. And after South Australia, in terms of deployment, you find Victoria, and then have Western Australia with 53 megawatts deployed, and the Northern Territory, Queensland, and Tasmania. And New South Wales, which is currently the state with the lowest amount of storage deployed. On the right-hand side of the graph, so all this data is based on our database of projects, so it's meant to be conservative, but on the right-hand side, what we've done is that we've taken all the projects operational, but we've added to these projects, sorry, all the projects that are either announced by a developer and that we judge as viable. So we believe the project has a location, has a defined off-taker, etc. And there is more than 4 gigawatts of storage projects announced in Australia. So we project that the market volume is multiplied by more than 10 over the next 3 years. And you can see here again that South Australia comes out first with more than 2 gigawatts of projected capacity within 2023. Then you get New South Wales, and then Victoria with a lot of project plans, as well as Queensland to finish with, and Western Australia. Right, if we look at all of these storage projects deployed today to more than 300 megawatts, what are they doing? What's their role within the market? And what we see is that more than 42% of these projects provide ancillary services to the grid. So frequency control and ancillary services mainly. Then the largest second bit is arbitrage on the energy markets. And then you have a variety of different services. So renewable energy integration really means when the battery is coupled to a renewable power plant and shifting part of the electricity production. Microgrid refers to any storage system that would be absolutely isolated from the grid and being coupled with diesel, with renewables to ensure stability, for instance, and ensure that the grid can run with more renewables. And the rest is still, the rest of the applications are still a minority in Australia. Right, so that was it for the big picture. Now I've mentioned that South Australia comes first in terms of project deployed and in terms also of projects announced with 2 gigawatts. So what I'll do within the next 5 minutes is that I'll try and find out, look precisely what's happened and what's happening in South Australia to make it so attractive for storage. Here is the amount of, it's the electricity mix of South Australia that is published on the AEMO website. And you see that South Australia represents 8% of the population and has 41% wind energy penetration over the past 12 months. The rest is mainly gas, solar. Is mainly gas and a bit of solar. Sorry. What's important to realize here is that 31% wind is actually quite a high penetration. Catherine mentioned earlier that Ireland they had experience in Ireland and it has high renewable penetration as well. What the levels of wind penetration you have here are comparable to Ireland, which is obviously a bit less well interconnected than South Australia, but it's the kind of intermittency level that is very very high and close to Ireland in Europe. The other important thing to realize on South Australia is that it's not very well interconnected. Here is a map of the grid, and you only have two interconnectors in the eastern part of the country, and Haywood, which is the largest of both, is only 650 megawatts. So one thing is, well, it's not that low, 650 megawatts. It's a decent interconnection. However, if you look at the 2 gigawatts of wind within the state, it's a bit more in proportion. And the other element is there's a single line, a transmission line going from Haywood to most of the consumption in South Australia. And what that means is, in terms of contingency, if this connection fails, there's a lot of flexibility that is lost from the grid, because what needs to be remembered is an interconnection is actually a source of flexibility with generation flexibility, storage, and demand side response. So losing this interconnector creates, having all of this capacity, this flexible capacity within one interconnector, creates a risk on the production for the export and import capacity. Right, so it's only interconnected to Victoria. Now looking at what happened in the past years, so that's not fresh news on this slide, but I always think it's good to analyze elements taking a step backwards, because you can see it's easier to see and find out why and how things happened. So back in 2016, 2017, there were a couple, actually 4 blackouts in South Australia. So in September, there were huge storms that did damage transmission lines. And well, the wind ride through settings were not compliant, so the voltage drop caused the generation to trip. In November, so the following months, there was maintenance issue on Haywood. South Australia was electrically islanded. So it's an issue because it's, again, this lack of flexibility coming from this interconnector. So in December, another month after, storms have damaged transmission lines. And in February 2019, there was a heat wave in South Australia, having a large impact due to HVAC and other systems on the electricity demand. And there was a fail in instruction for a generator. So I've summarized these events within the timeline here, plus added a couple of events like coal station closing or Victoria Interconnected being upgraded. So that's in blue, the changes to the system in South Australia. In red, you can see the failures, right? Which are the blackouts I've just mentioned. And in green, there was the proposal for long-term resolution. So there was a plan from the government in March 2017 to solve this issue. And of course, the famous tweet from Elon Musk saying a storage system could be deployed in 100 days. The good thing about this communication is that it proved that storage can be deployed very fast. And in between the contract signing and the commissioning, there was indeed only 72 days. So in between the RFP award and the commissioning, it was 132 days. So it proves how fast storage can be deployed to solve a problem, because in between the time it was pointed, so in March and November, the problem was partially solved. So this 100 megawatt system that became famous, and that is one of the largest installed today, proved its interest for South Australia, even though, as Catherine mentioned, it's not a project that is merchant based, and it has a long-term contract with the government. Right. So deep diving a bit more into this project, which has actually received, which has been extended earlier with, I think it's earlier this year, with 50 megawatt increase. A bit of numbers and a bit on its activity. So this 100 megawatt, 129 megawatt hour storage system mainly provides frequency regulation. I've put up here the battery cost because it's public. It's in the reports from Neoen when they went public. So because I've seen in the chat docs that some of you did ask questions, so it's a figure that's not up to date, of course, because it's from 2017, but it's still a good markup to have. And actually, the project is split in two parts. One is providing FCAS, so that's 70 megawatts and approximately 40 megawatt hour. And the other part is doing arbitrage on the wholesale energy market. And you can actually see it on the graph on the bottom part of the slide, where you have the battery being activated and the frequency regulation market, and the big power blocks that correspond to trades on the wholesale market. So both on the left and right side, it's the same operation pattern that you can see. So with the small spikes corresponding to the frequency requirements, and the blocks corresponding to the trades made by the battery. Right. So it was challenging for me to discuss Australia without discussing this project, which is one of the early ones and an interesting reference, even though it's not new. Here are a couple of figures. Also, I've mentioned that the battery earned as much as 1 million Australian dollar within 2 days by making trades on the energy market. So that's an impressive figure, of course, for a battery that costs 56 million euros. It's not that much, but it proves that it's possible to get merchant revenues with battery storage system. Right. So what I was wondering after preparing these slides is, okay, so now what are the available revenues for storage in Australia? I think it's been highlighted by Catherine that it's not likely that there is a specific support scheme for storage, or at least at Clean Horizon we don't think it's going to happen. That's one. So really a specific subsidy is not going to happen. Creating regulatory framework to enable storage deployment will happen, but without any specific incentive, I believe. Or at least I believe that having a specific incentive for storage is not necessarily good for the market, because markets are driven by supply and demand and by what's needed. And if the market conditions exist and if the regulatory framework is set up, battery storage systems will find their place within the existing markets to provide support to the grid. As you probably understood, today there is two main revenues for storage in Australia. The first one is trading, so it's arbitrage on the energy markets. We've mentioned that the trading is currently 30 minutes settlement, but it will change to 5 minutes in October. What we've seen at Clean Horizon when the settlement period changes and is reduced is that, and it's confirmed based on cases in Germany, in the UK, the smallest, the shortest the product duration, the higher the volatility on these markets. In other words, the lowest price is lower and the highest price is higher, and it changes faster, of course, because the settlement is lower. The second interesting revenue is the revenues available on the FCAS market. FCAS represents a range of services, and I'll discuss this a bit later, but essentially its frequency regulation is well known worldwide to be the low-hanging fruit for storage, because storage is fast. It can go both upward and downward. So symmetric products are a good fit. So this is to illustrate how we compute the business cases for storage on the wholesale market. What I've done is that I've downloaded from the AEMO website the prices on the spot electricity market from New South Wales on the last year, and I've taken each 12-hour period. So it's fairly simple. We can do it on each 12-hour period. I've taken the maximum clearing price and the lowest clearing price. What this means, what this represents, is how much can a battery be paid to discharge if it catches the maximum price, and how low can it charge if it catches the lowest price. And the difference between those two is the spread. And so the spread is really the difference between the maximum and the minimum on 12-hour periods. And I've computed the average 12-hour spread in New South Wales. It's actually currently at 124 Australian dollars per megawatt hour. What this means is that if you have a 1-hour battery, you can charge and discharge twice a day, so doing 2 cycles a day, and you can catch a revenue of almost 250 Australian dollars. Well, actually, there's a typo here. It's it's 248 Australian dollars per megawatt per day, and on a year it means that it's the approximate revenue you can catch is 55,000 Australian dollars per megawatt per year. So this is not enough to make a business case on its own for now. So the question is, what will be the impact of 5-minute settlement? That's the first. And the second is, what's the future pricing on these markets going to look like? What is another big takeaway is that you can see the spreads sometimes are very high and sometimes are low. What this means is that some spreads are worth catching and some are not. And we will see it in the end, but what we do in our sizing is that we do the optimal combination of both trading on the wholesale market and FCAS, so that you can catch the highest spreads when the light blue bars get very high, so you can be on the energy market during these times, and during the rest of the time when the spread is low, like in January 2020, you can be active on the FCAS market. Right, so deep diving into the FCAS market. Sorry, there's a lot of text on this slide. But I wanted to introduce you to the services in FCAS. And there's actually 2 types of services. One is called the regulation service, and the other ones are called a type of the contingency service. So regulation is not a symmetric service. You've got a raise service and a lower service to go up and down to correct frequency deviations. These 2 signals are based, so the regulation signal, these 2 regulation signals are based on an AGC signal, whereas contingency is based on the frequency measured at the site. So the battery storage system will not receive an AGC signal from the dispatch center. It will simply be operated based on the frequency it measures on the network. I've segmented all of the contingency services. I won't go through all of them here. What's important to understand is what makes a difference between one and the other is the activation time, mainly. So from 6 seconds to 5 minutes. And the other important thing to mention about contingency is that oppositely to regulation, it's only meant to be used when there's a big issue on the grid. So when there's really a large frequency deviation. In other words, contingency is paid, but it's very, very rarely used. So put into action, whereas regulation is used very often. And that's also what you could see on the Hornsdale power plant operation. There's a lot of spikes here and there corresponding to frequency variations. Right, so now how is it paid, FCAS? The FCAS have, well, if a battery tomorrow gets selected for FCAS in Australia, it gets a weighing coefficient based on its speed of response. And you would get 100% weighing factor if you can react in 0 seconds, which of course storage cannot do, even though it's very quick. We're talking about a couple 100 milliseconds. It's not yet at 0 seconds. So the weighing factor that you have in the table here, so for instance, for Hans there, you can see it's downgraded to 80 or to 63, 19, and 41 for different services. So this is weighing the price on the FCAS market. So you get this weight based on the markets, and the markets have so you have markets for each of the services. And what's interesting is that you can stack revenues from all of these services. So you can provide, of course, up and down regulation, but you can also provide contingency. And what will happen in case you provide both is that when the grid needs contingency, you will, the AEMO rules state that you are allowed to stop providing regulation to give priority to the contingency service. However, when contingency is activated, what we understand is that you will not be paid anymore for the regulation service, of course, because you start providing it if it's with the same megawatt. So that's our understanding so far of the payments of these services. The activation of the contingency is not public today, so we don't know how often the contingency service is activated. However, due to its definition, that it's only activated in case of very high frequency deviation, we understand it should be rare that this service is activated. So FCAS is, just to wrap it up on FCAS, it's a very interesting market for storage. It's purely merchant, of course. There's no long-term contracts. And today, if we see that the projects, the revenues are interesting, there is some issues with the development, and I'll come to it in a second. So now looking at the revenues for storage, I've only taken 5 revenue streams, whereas I've shown you probably more than 8 FCAS revenues. These are the 5 most interesting revenues for storage on FCAS. So the regulation revenues provide the best payment today, and the contingency revenues, which are delayed raise, slow raise, and fast raise, have a lower payment, but it's still good to have. So in total, we assume today a battery, well, in 2019, if there was a battery fully merchant on the FCAS market, it would have made up to 60 Australian dollars per megawatt per hour. Please note this is per megawatt per hour and not per megawatt hour, because this service is paid based on the megawatts available on the markets, not based on the energy. And this amount of revenue, so 40 USD per megawatt per hour, is a high enough revenue to make a business case for storage. However, as it is a market and as batteries are being deployed, these prices are expected to reduce. So this is an interesting projection to make, but as there is an opportunity to seize on the market, on this market, and as storage is being deployed, these prices will reduce. The question is how fast will they decrease and to which level? And the second revenue stream that I mentioned earlier, which pays less, as you've seen, the arbitrage on the energy markets will be key because it will provide a floor for these revenues. So your forecast of the future spread will provide you with a limit on how low the FCAS prices can go, because the batteries at this point will stop going on FCAS and will go and doing arbitrage, just like what happened in other markets. What hinders commercial projects to go live, from our understanding, is that the grid fees in Australia are extremely high. Plus there is this merchant risk, so it's not easy to deploy projects today. Right, so that's it for my presentation. I'm happy to take questions if there are any, Roman.
Hi, Corentin. Thank you so much for your really impressive presentation. And now let's just get to the really exciting Q&A session. So like the first question for quarantine is specifically for quarantine. How are you analyzing the facility of revenue streams from ancillary markets?
Yes, so I think I've kind of tackled this one. Um, Essentially, yes, it's possible to get revenues from ancillary services in Australia, and it will be one of the main. I mean, it's the low-hanging fruit, as I've mentioned, for storage, and we will see storage being deployed to provide ancillary services. The key question here is how are these revenues going to evolve in Australia, um, and how are the grid fees also hindering project development?
Okay, so the second one for quarantine is Corentin is what is the lesson learned in Australia on how to really accelerate the energy storage market growth in the other part of the world?
Mm. So my, I mean, what I would take, my take on this is um, what is shown in Australia is that if there is, and especially how I've illustrated on South Australia, is that if there is an issue on the grid, storage can be a solution, and that's actually a great message to of the grids. It's that storage is a solution and it can be deployed fast. We see a lot of countries having regulatory barriers for storage and for deployment because they often see storage like renewables as an issue on the grid, a potential issue creating troubles in terms of of the energy they inject, in terms of voltage. And what we spend a lot of time explaining is how storage should be seen as an asset and an advantage to the grid that solves problem rather than a constraint for the grid. And additionally, it can be deployed very fast. So that's, I think, my takeaway for the lessons learned in Australia.
Okay, so the last one is how much is the production for total storage system implementation, and in which steps for the coming 5 years, like how investor benefit from it?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the only public data on this is the Hornsdale power plant so far because they have communicated on their revenues, and I've shown this a bit. To answer your question, you need to answer the question: how will the prices on the ancillary services markets evolve in the next 5 years, and how will the prices of battery evolve in the next 5 years? So it's a very interesting question. We probably need to sit down and discuss this further. But for now, the revenues are high. I've mentioned 40 USD per megawatt per hour for FCAS. That's a high payment, and that makes a business case viable today. So indeed, the question is, how will it evolve in the future, and how will the energy markets share of revenues in the business case of a storage system increase? Because I think that's one of the key evolutions to forecast of this market, as the ancillary services market is always a market more shallow than the energy market.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And also, like in the live streaming, I have collected some answer from our audience in this session. And also, the first question in our live streaming is, pumped storage and also solar thermal technologies is actually not at a really disadvantageous position in Australia these days compared to battery storage. So could you please sort of explain why this technology is not as popular as battery storage in this country, Australia?
That's a good question. I don't think it's about solar, right? I was reading another one, but that's a good question. I think, well, it's so indeed it's in terms of prices, it has this technology has a good track record. What's hindering its development, I think, is the lack of confidence from the investor side on this, and its lack of flexibility. It's not as fast and flexible as batteries, but I mean, it has its potential. It's a very different technology. It's better for longer duration. So maybe we'll see it come up in the longer run when we really need to shift larger blocks of energy from a period to another.
Okay. So currently, you haven't mentioned, like the situation of energy storage in South Australia in your presentation. And also one of our audience asked, like to what content is the growth in battery installation in South Australia expected to reduce the very pronounced dark curve with intraday negative pricing that currently exists in South Australia? You can see the full question in your Q&A box.
Yeah, so I mean, indeed, what storage will do, and there will be a lot of storage doing arbitrage on the energy market, is that it will flatten a bit the curve, as it will do arbitrage and take electricity from the lowest amount, the low prices to high prices during the peak. So it will a bit flatten out the curve. So that's definitely right. And the spreads will reduce, of course, as batteries are deployed. I'm seeing another question which is quite interesting and picking it up, Holnam, which is, and it's important that it's understood from Yangshi, saying on the regulation side, why does the battery get compensated both for regulation up and down? Well, that's fairly simple. It's because the battery can be charged and discharged, so you can get the payments both for being available to charge and discharge at the same time. However, the frequency of the AGC signal can only be one way or another. So it's either a charging signal or a discharging signal. So you can get paid for both and accumulate these both revenues.
Okay, then thank you so much for your really impressive answer, Corentin.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so next let me introduce Mr. Stephen Goldman and Mr. Achal Sondhi. So they will share the last session as our presenter. Mr. Stephen Goldman leads the marketing and communication efforts in Asia Pacific region for Fluence. In this capacity, Stephen works with media analysts and stakeholders to promote energy storage technologies, diverse application and benefit to generators, networks, and large energy users across APAC region. And Achal Sondhi is the APAC market director at Fluence. In this role, he supports the regional sales team and helps a customer identify applications that are attractive and also economical for energy storage development. Hi, Stephen and Achal, please start your presentation.
Thank you so much, Holnam. Just starting the slides. Can you see the presentation?
Yep, I can see it good.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. If you aren't familiar with Fluence, we're a market-leading supplier of energy storage globally. That's taken the form of pioneering innovative applications and designing, deploying, and providing long-term servicing of grid-scale energy storage assets. To date, our firm currently has over 2,000 megawatts of projects deployed or awarded in 22 countries and territories to date. Change slides. Why are we in this industry? Because our team has very deep roots in the power sector, having come from AES, a global independent power producer, and from Siemens. Our team delivered the first advanced battery storage system in 2008 in the US for the PJM power market. And then the following year, put the first commercial project into service in Chile, providing ancillary services and inertia to enable a thermal plant in the Atacama Desert to run at higher and more consistent output. That market has built dramatically over time to the point where we now have quite a large pipeline of projects that are either deployed already or in motion. Just to give you a sense, I mean, the energy storage sector has grown very organically. Markets first learned about storage through the most urgent needs. Most often, that's taking the form of ancillary services for grid stability or managing for contingencies. as was the case in Australia. But as we're seeing around the globe, as energy transitions and decarbonization are accelerating around the world, we're seeing storage procurements accelerate in terms of speed and scale. The leading customers are procuring, instead of single assets, they're starting to procure entire fleets. We recently announced actually working with a single customer to deploy a portfolio of over 500 megawatts in Southeast Asia. And others are envisioning mega projects that can replace thermal generation for peaking, as we'll discuss today. Or we are looking at energy storage as a resource for adding capacity on congested transmission corridors. That's what drove the development of Fluence's latest generation of technology solutions, which you can see in front of you, is this idea of mass customization. That's the ability to shift from more bespoke systems, which is how systems were delivered previously, to a more standardized factory assembled type of system that can be replicated at scale. What we've done now is brought together a standardized form factor, what we're calling the Fluence Cube, with an integrated operations platform that can draw on the more than 40 applications that we've already developed to date, and a digital intelligence layer that can help owners and operators improve the performance of their storage assets and reduce operating costs. As Australia has already seen the strong performance that batteries can provide on shorter duration applications, managing frequency faster than other resources available, and able to dispatch power to meet peak power needs in less than a second. But as we've seen in other markets, this is just scratching the surface of what energy storage can do. Part of why we've worked to standardize our systems is actually to try and meet the most pressing needs on the grid. I won't walk through each of these systems here, but you'll see GridStack is really focused on the most demanding power applications. SunStack is focused on PV optimized systems where you're co-locating storage and solar together. And then EdgeStack is focused on providing connection ready systems for commercial and industrial applications. So what we're seeing in the marketplace now is that other applications are being called on even more so than just what we've already heard from Corentin today on the provision of frequency regulation and ancillary services, as well as bidding energy into the spot markets. That other applications are taking even more focus. First of all, batteries can deliver much faster performance than is currently being compensated for. The fastest procured ancillary service in the NEM, in Australia's national electricity market, requires a response within 6 seconds. However, in Ireland, they are already moving to procure faster grid services because they're recognizing that as they move to a higher degree of renewable energy adoption, they're going to need faster services in order to maintain grid stability and ensure the ability to rebalance within a second and not even along longer intervals. That led to Fluence working with Statkraft Ireland in partnership to deliver a battery system that could provide fast frequency response for Ireland's DS3 program. That helps correct frequency at a speed 40 times faster than the current fastest service that's procured in Australia, providing a response within 150 milliseconds. But the bigger service that we're seeing emerging on the horizon is actually the bigger need in Australia. Sorry, I had to advance my slides. Being driven by coal retirements and a much higher deployment of renewable energy. The need that's emerging is around flexibility and dispatchability that replaces but not replicates what we've come to know as baseload power. In Australia, the first generation of big batteries were providing flexible but admittedly limited capacity to help meet peak demand. As you'll see on the right-hand side, the current spread of batteries that are installed are providing at most 2 hours of capacity for peaking purposes. The Hornsdale installation in South Australia provides less than 80 minutes. The current ones in Victoria are providing an hour. But what I'll show you is that what we've learned in other markets is that batteries are capable of much more in terms of providing peaking capacity. Apologies, I'm trying to advance my slides. I'm moving a little slowly. So on your screen now, you'll see a project that's under construction now in California. This is a 100 megawatt, 400 megawatt hour, 4-hour duration storage peaker. This project was actually, it's called the Alamitos Energy Center. And it was actually the first energy storage resource to secure a 20-year contract to provide capacity back in 2014. And it's going to be providing local reliability for the Los Angeles area. This project's targeted for completion in early 2021. It's a standalone battery asset with a similar footprint to a data center or a big box retail store. And this is taking the place of retired single cycle gas generation. This early contract started the trend that we're seeing continue now with more recently procured projects in the Western states in the US, where projects are continuing to receive contracts to serve as what they call resource adequacy resources, essentially availability or capacity payments, where they're receiving a higher payment for availability, but they're leaving, and that leaves a smaller portion to be secured via merchant revenues, the way we were seeing in Australia, via ancillary services or the energy revenues. And this is now being driven either at the state level or pursued by vertically integrated utilities, i.e. this is not a federal policy. This is not a top-down policy being driven by US federal law. What this is resulting in is a faster rate in coal replacements because utilities are increasingly seeing that renewables paired with storage are providing the lowest cost form of energy. That's having the result of making coal plants, for example, less economic and driving retirements. In the US, there was a recent study that found, coal plants are increasingly operating as cyclical or load following generation units, and the power market's becoming more and more saturated with intermittent resources and low cost renewable energy. What we've already seen happen is that from 2010 to the first quarter of 2019, power companies are pulling the plug on more than 546 coal-fired power units nationwide, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. What that's also done is driven down the capacity factors of those operating coal plants, or how much actual power that those plants are generating versus how they're capable of generating. That's dropped from, for example, on average from 74% in 2008 to 54% in 2018. What that's leading to now is more and more utilities are moving to retire and replace coal plants in favor of combinations of renewables and storage. To give you an example, PacifiCorp, which is owned by Berkshire Hathaway, and you may know through Warren Buffett, is a utility that serves 6 states. They're moving to retire and replace 5 coal plants in the state of Wyoming by 2028. And they're going to replace them. They've just put out an RFP over the last, I think it was last week, for a combination of 1,800 megawatts of solar paired with 595 megawatts of storage and 1,900 megawatts of wind, all by 2024 to supply for its service area. Now, those transactions are going to actually take the form of either 15 to 30-year power purchase agreements or build and then transfer transactions, where others will build those facilities and then transfer them to the utility. In a neighboring state, Nevada, NV Energy is moving to add over 1,200 megawatts of solar paired with almost 600 megawatts of 4 to 5 hours storage. And then in other states, these similar conditions are driving the retirement of older gas generation as well. We're seeing utilities increasingly choosing renewables or a mix of renewables and storage over new gas generation. To give another example, in Arizona, a key utility has already dropped its plans for gas peakers and is instead moving to procure 850 megawatts of storage for peaking purposes by 2025 instead of new gas. That's going to allow them to add capacity incrementally and better match their load growth and system needs. On the other side of the US, in Virginia, the monopoly utility has also made a similar move. They had previously been planning to procure natural gas capacity in pipelines, and those were getting repeatedly rejected due to gas oversupply and a lack of consideration of lower cost resources. And now have been pushed through the rejection of those plans to now look at lower cost resources like renewables and renewables paired with storage. Lastly, one more example I'd like to point out. There was a 750 megawatt gas peaking plant in California that's now being retired 20 years early due to lack of use. And the site is actually the site that the land was the plant was housed on is actually being sold as a potential future site for battery storage. So all of these factors are showing how in markets where renewables and renewables paired with storage are providing increasingly low cost energy, that that utilities are starting to consider these as the lowest cost resource. What's the key to that? The ability to bring them in as a source of flexible capacity. But we would like to offer an additional strategy for consideration. And for that, I'd like to pivot over to my colleague, Achal.
Great. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the introduction. I'm Achal Sondhi. Pleasure to speak to everyone today. And so I think this is really good. I've done a few webinars, and I think, Catherine, I need to find a better background than this, like you had. Essentially, I think the earlier conversations were really helpful because Catherine kind of led up to what's happening in Australia and what's going to happen soon. Corentin actually touched on storage and how the market is evolving for storage and how it exists. We want to touch on a bit more of what's happening in the States that Stephen alluded to with peaking capacity and meeting the peak power requirements, and how that's actually something that could be addressed in Australia with energy storage and more efficiently. So for actually a year or so, we've been in different countries having several kind of campaigns where we say we don't need any more peaking capacity provided by thermal generation. It's just absolutely not needed. And a lot of the countries are facing similar fundamentals. They've been described in the previous talk, so I won't go too much into them, but retirement of existing resources, large penetration renewables, need for local capacity given changes in supply and demand in different parts of the grid, and finally more flexibility. So with that, what we want to show is how storage can actually provide peak power. And Stephen, if you could move to the next slide, please. One of the first things is, really, can storage do the job that a peaking thermal capacity power plant can do? And the answer is yes. Utilities will be, well, can I trust it? It's a new technology? The answer is no, it's not a new technology. It's been around for a while. As Stephen said, we deployed the first asset over 10 years ago. It is another tool you have in your kit to deploy on the grid. And as you can see, the three questions that come up when you're looking at a peaking capacity plant or an asset to provide peaking capacity: is it available? Is it reliable? And then finally, is it flexible? And then with all three regards, storage definitely meets, if not surpasses, that requirement. And that's critical for anyone who's planning and depending on storage to replace or substitute any peaking requirement we need to meet on the grid. The best way to show this, and so if Stephen, if you could just move to the next slide, is actually walking through an example. And I think we've just chosen a simple example. If you have a 3,000 megawatt grid and you have a retirement, or you have more renewable energy, or a change, if you scroll back, please. And if you have more change in the demand forecast due to localized generation or energy efficiency, you end up having a peak as shown on the left graph. And that peak could, be in variation of duration from 8 hours to 2 hours, even less. And the idea here is capturing the low-hanging fruit, efficiently. So in the past, a utility would say, I need to serve 3,000 megawatts throughout the year when it's called on. But in reality, that actual last 400 or 300 megawatts probably is only called on for 2 to 5 hours in a year. So you're building large thermal plants that will barely be used for a couple of hours in the year, which is inefficient. It was the reality before, but today it's not needed, and so storage can replace that job. And what we've noticed is a lot of utilities used to have something called range anxiety, saying, well, a battery can only go on for so many hours, but again, as back to my example, you only need it for a certain number of hours a day. So that's why, looking at the graph on the right, if you actually looked at the peak and pieced it out by 1 hour duration, how many times you need something for 4 hours, and how many times you need something for more than 6 hours, and so on, you can do a portfolio around storage with thermal to optimize your delivery of power required in the peaking period. So Stephen, if you could move to the next slide, please. Doing some simple math around this, and these are indicative numbers, but in magnitude and direction, they actually reflect a portfolio we recently analyzed. Let me first show you to the right. If you were to replace that full 500 megawatts with thermal only at the price of a thermal asset, you're going to have as it shows here, maybe a bill of $600 million. But if you were to piece it out by duration, meaning I take a 2-hour duration, a 4-hour duration, and 8-hour duration, said I can meet the 2-hour and 4-hour batteries, 2-hour and 4-hour duration, sorry, with batteries and take a lower price per kilowatt hour. And then the replacement is what we would say is our new peak for thermal or our new base load. You end up having with a bill that's much lower, so therefore the consumer ends up with a lower cost on the grid. So just in pure economics, we can see there's a benefit of doing such an analysis and seeing how you can meet the peak with storage. We've always said that storage is best used when it can displace a high capex underutilized asset, being a transmission line. And some of you may have seen, we did submit into a public tender for a transmission asset, could be replaced with storage, or even a large thermal capacity plant, which is being underutilized. Moving forward, Steve, if you could go to the next slide. So just taking an analysis done by a third party, BNEF, that actually did an analysis of how many gigawatts are there that actually require less than 6-hour duration in the world. So of course, these numbers range quite significantly, but if you look at it on a percentage of the total grid, it's quite decent of low-hanging fruit to capture in the markets. So for Australia, it's right now 6 gigawatts, around 10% of the market today could be met by could be met with something that can deliver 6 hours duration of power in a day. And so does it make sense with more retiring assets on the grid to replace that with thermal capacity that won't be running all year long, or would it be more efficient to supply that power with assets that are designed for shorter durations? And so that's the whole, this analysis was very good. There will be an update to this, I presume. And so I expect that number to go up as you have more penetration of renewables. So this is a year ago, and I'm pretty sure this will increase. Steve, if you could go to the next slide, please. So now that we've confirmed that storage can do the job, it can do the job economically, and there's an addressable market, some operators are concerned, will it still make money? And the answer is yes, there needs to be a commercial structure put around how we can compensate batteries for doing such a job. There are some in Australia with cap contracts. You could take on the merchant risk if a developer desired so, because some are, and they're leading the market today by doing so, and taking most of the opportunity. But there are ways of, the theme with storage has always been value stacking, and you can always value stack more services in those hours or parts of the year where storage is not needed for providing peaking capacity. So for example, if you've set up a plant to serve 2 hours in the summer every day, during winter or spring or autumn, you might be able to use the storage for some other services, maybe paired with a renewable. There are various kind of commercial arrangements that could be addressed or figured out. And that's Fluence likes to partner with customers to figure these things out to make more projects commercially viable. It's what we've been doing for 12 years. It's in our DNA. And if you move forward, Stephen, to the next slide, the Rocky Mountain Institute had actually done an analysis on US plants. So if you were to build a gas plant today, they face being underutilized, they face being stranded assets. And so what I wanted to kind of highlight with the slide is maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, if you were to build a gas plant or a coal plant, project financing it for 25 years, 30 years would be feasible. It would make sense if you had a long-term PPA and taking a merchant tail. But the risk today is with more storage, more renewables, the merchant tail of some of these assets, or if the assets have a shorter duration PPAs, you will face stranded assets on the road. And that risk is significant because it will be, again, a burden on customers and the population of the country. And so that's something that this analysis was done on the US side. I think I would encourage other countries to look into this because it does pose a significant cost to the system. Moving on to the next slide, and I'm just trying to be mindful of time here. One thing is the graph on the left, and I know geographically it's not perfect, but we wanted to make sure that it looks clear to people. We've had centralized grids with large thermal stations in one part, and then distributing power to load centers through transmission networks. Now we're having renewable generation pop up in different parts of the country, and they may be facing some transmission congestion. What we're saying is once these thermal assets do retire, some of the peak can be met by storage more efficiently, and some of the peak and the base load will be met by replacement thermal generation. We're not doubting that, and that base load is still required. And so if you could just click once, Stephen, please. The way we see it is, you may have a thermal asset in the same location, you may have a battery in the same location, but it's not necessary to have the required amount of battery in the exact same location. You could spread it across as a fleet nearer to load centers. And one of the biggest things here is it's actually freeing up one of the most expensive real estates, which is transmission corridors, which can now be used for further renewable generation to be moved through the system without having to upgrade transmission and spend on more poles and wires. I think Stephen introduced our latest 6th generation, which is modular in fashion, and we believe the modularity is important because today we may need 500 megawatts of storage as per my recent example. Tomorrow, if the demand goes up slightly, we may need 550. And so it may be in one city has grown in demand more, or one city has had more renewable penetration, and therefore the peak has increased. So if you can see on the top right, it's kind of hard to see, but if that load center had a higher peak the following year, you could just add on an extra battery at the load center or somewhere else on the transmission network to support that load center, and it done in a timely manner. And I think our other speakers mentioned how quickly storage can be deployed. Also, in a more, the scale doesn't have to be making a massive plant every time to to add on to the power you need. It can just be done in a modular fashion. So with all of this, I just want to recap, like we said, we wanted to address, again, storage can do several jobs, be it transmission, ancillary service, arbitrage. There's a peaking requirement on most grids, and that peak is going to get more and more significant with renewable penetration. And what we wanted to identify today is, yes, storage can deliver that. It can meet the same requirements. We know storage can do that economically. We know that there's a risk of building large thermal assets to provide that service because of stranded assets. We also know that storage can have additional benefits depending on a case-to-case basis. And finally, you can optimize your grid further and further leverage existing transmission assets by placing storage as a fleet across your system rather than in one location. And that's why we're saying that storage is used. We think that there's a job to be done on the grid. And in specific, the one job we're addressing today is that peaking power requirement. And so we're asking that we need, as all stakeholders in the energy industry, to find a way to push that job be done by storage, energy storage, because it can be. It's a technology that's proven. And that's why we like the quote, which is on our final slide, which was by Henry Ford. He said that, if he had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. And in this regard, we're not saying let's build exactly the same amount of thermal we needed as before. What we're saying is build some thermal that's just really needed for base load, but replace the rest of that power requirement with storage and combination of renewables, because that's the cheaper option and the more efficient option. So with that, I think we draw our presentation to a conclusion, and thank you and open for questions.
Hi, Stephen and Achal. Thank you so much for your really informative presentation. And right now, let's get to the Q&A session. We have actually collected some questions before live streaming in the registration session. So the first question is, what are the key energy storage policies that the government should consider to promote the market growth and attract investment?
I can take that one. I think what we see is that really compensating reserve or peak power requirements with long-term contracts that reduce merchant risk would probably be one of the most helpful policies to move storage forward in Australia. And it's similar to the examples I mentioned from the US. We also think that storage is eventually going to join the types of resources in Australia that can earn a regulated return as a regulated network asset. I mean, we've already seen it go as be included for consideration under RIT-T tests. So our expectation is it's going to move forward as a transmission asset as well.
Okay, so the second question is, how different will the Australian energy storage market from the other, of the other markets, such as Europe or the US market?
How different? I think it's going to be a lot more fundamental in driving growth in Australia. In particular, given there's a lot of coal as mid-merit generation, the topology of the transmission network in Australia, that it's much longer, stringier, less interconnected by comparison than, say, the EU or the US grids. There's no neighboring countries, for example, to provide the balancing. And we're seeing these very high renewable energy targets nationwide, driven by the states. Eventually, that's going to be the goal of all countries. So I think Australia it's been interesting in how storage can drive growth here because it's supporting the rapid deployment of renewable energy. It can quickly do the job around peaking assets the way we were talking through in our presentation, and it can help support shoring up and adding capacity on transmission networks as more generations popping up in places that it previously wasn't envisioned.
Okay. So another audience are actually really interested in learning more about Fluence's recent VTL proposal. Could you please sort of share it with us?
I can mention a little bit in brief. Essentially, this was a proposal that was submitted to the Australian energy market operator. They had asked they had put out a call for proposals around non-network options for upgrading the Victoria and New South Wales interconnector. So Fluence actually proposed a pair of battery assets that would sit on opposite sides of the interconnector, one on the Victoria side and one on the New South Wales side. I won't go into a lot of detail here, but the submission is public on AEMO's website and is available to view. So I would recommend that people go and delve into it there. What we did find is that it would offer much greater benefit to the network overall and a fair amount of savings by comparison. So I'd recommend checking out the submission, and we're happy to discuss over email the email addresses that we posted before if you're interested.
Stephen, thank you so much for your answer. And also is like Achal's turn. So the last question is for you. What are business models that are possible to enable energy storage in Australia? Or is this subsidized by the government currently?
Okay. Thanks. Actually, we agreed before the call. Stephen might take all the questions, but I'm happy to answer these. So the business model. So firstly, I mean, some of the first batteries that came on, there was some subsidized, cash grants given. We do, as Corentin mentioned, there are two revenue streams right now that we're seeing. And a lot of, I think I do want to allude that a lot of developers are looking into tackling the market with these merchant revenue streams, and they are going to be leading the market when it comes to storage because they're getting ahead of the game on the opportunity that exists. There are cap contracts out there that need to be more utilized for storage to enable, just to address exactly what we discussed, a peaking capacity requirement. So that's one contract that already exists to support gas plants and coal plants, which could be used to support storage at the right pricing structure. Additionally, of course, longer term PPAs that do filter in with storage or solar and wind contracts would be welcome. I think utilities need to start looking into that when they do any sort of long-term PPA with renewables. To stabilize their grid, to support their grid services, It could be a mechanism to start contracting storage and bringing it onto the local grid when needed. I don't think a subsidy is really necessary. And I think what I want to allude to, and I've said this in many webinars and talks, and Corentin actually and I spoke on one panel before where I said the exact same thing. Giving a subsidy means this technology is not ready. I don't think that's true. It's ready. I think setting a target for Australia saying we need X storage by 2022, we need X storage by 2024, will signal an even stronger kind of message to everyone to define ways to deploy storage. And then then the market itself will find innovative ways to make structures work, because today we know the economics already work out for storage. So that's in short how we feel about the commercial structures behind what needed for storage.
Actually, Achal, if I can add on top of that, I mean, that
Yep.
was what I was alluding to with all the examples from the US, is that they haven't been driving this through subsidies. They haven't been driving this through a top-down federal policy. This has been happening either from state level targets or just simply from utilities that are looking at the lowest cost resources and recognizing that renewables paired with storage are providing a much more compelling set of resources rather than either the existing generation or building new gas peakers. So it's really been a question of the economics more than policy forcing them in a particular direction.
Okay, thank you so much for both of you answer on the pre-asked question. So there are actually some question in the live streaming question Q&A box. So there is one audience called GMAC when it specifically asks Stephen. So she or he want to ask, are all those storage capacity development or in the pipeline purely commercially driven investment? Is no state or federal assisted or supported incentives or co-investment involved? Who are the main financier to most of these projects? Capital markets, conventional financing?
So it's going to vary by market. For example, in California, the primary parties that are securing those resources are investor-owned or like publicly traded utilities. California's particular market is setting targets for those utilities to procure resources to provide local capacity for reliability, but it's not stating specifically what technology that needs to be. And so what a lot of the utilities in California have found is that energy storage has provided a very compelling resource for securing that capacity. In other markets, you've seen across the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, there have a lot of vertically integrated utilities, meaning utilities where they own generation, serve as a retailer, possibly even own the transmission as well. And so they're assessing it based on the economic benefit, the economic merits. To my mind, the only policy driver of that could be when you're pairing solar and storage, you have the ability to access a particular tax credit. But other than that, there's no federal incentive for them to do so, and there haven't been, because they're state level integrated utilities. There's not a state level incentive for them to do so. They're doing this primarily based on the economics.
Okay, I'll just add to that really quick. So also in the last, 10, 12 years, we've been doing projects. The first set of projects have come off balance sheet, but in the last, I'd say 3 to 4 years, we're seeing more and more project finance supporting these projects. So you're seeing lenders getting comfortable, be it half of these may have merchants, some of them may have full contracts, but project finance companies are getting more comfortable with financing such assets. So to answer the capital markets question, that there is a more push from equity finances and debt finances on these projects.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Since this is actually the last session of today's webinar, we still got a lot of time to answer the last question. So Stephen and Achal, would you like to choose, the very last question in the Q&A box that you're probably interested in or that you feel like is necessary to answer at the moment?
I didn't have one picked out. Achal, I didn't know if there was one you wanted to jump to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm looking at this. Do we need, is there a need for longer than 6-hour storage? I mean, yes, that would generally be base load. So I think that, you can have 6-hour storage or longer, but that your longer duration is coming. We actually took out a slide just before the deck because of interest of time, where we show that, a few years down the road, we can see that more and more of the peak, more than 6 hours can be covered by storage as we see the prices come down. But for now, beyond 6 hours is a bit more economically challenging. And if you go into much longer duration, obviously that's base load. So that hopefully answers that one. The second question I see there on ancillary services, it varies by different projects. We have had projects that are supporting, depending on the configuration of the inverter used, to support reactive power and voltage support as well. And there isn't necessarily a direct compensation mechanism for that. But when it's a utility that's providing the purchasing the asset off their balance sheet, it's something they've asked for. And what it does is in turn, it creates a value stream for the utility of investment deferral. So they end up having to not spend on upgrading its SVC. And they.
Hello, everyone. I'm just trying to get my presentation ready to share.
A cost saving scheme, cost saving mechanism. And then, but there are also batteries we have out there that are purely ancillary services only and participating in the market. So hopefully that answers that question.
Well, and also what we're seeing, like Ireland in particular, they have a pay for performance incentive for faster performance. So the base response is required by AirGrid is within within 2 seconds. But as you get closer and closer to the higher end, and to the faster end of that scale, which is 150 milliseconds, the tariff actually scales up to the point of, if you actually can achieve within 150 seconds, you receive 3 times the tariff. So they're using a pay for performance incentive in order to get faster services into the market.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for your really impressive presentation, Stephen and Achal. Thank you so much. So this is pretty much all about today's webinar, energy storage in Australia. So finally, I'd like to post my appreciation on our presenters and their informative sharing, and of course the support from our exclusive sponsor, Clean Horizon, who has been really supportive to Leader Associates online events and also physical events all the time. And it helps energy storage players to monetize energy storage by offering market analysis, business development, and technical consulting. Anyone who is interested in this field can contact Corentin or anyone work for Clean Horizon afterwards after the webinar. So I hope everyone who is interested in this market could somehow get inspiration and get more knowledge after our speakers' impressive illustration. So please kindly note our slides and also video recording of today's webinar will be sent to all of you guys, an update on our YouTube channel, Leader Associates, after today's live streaming. So this is the end of today's webinar. Thanks again for staying with us, and wish you guys a really great day, and wish you guys have a really fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Corentin. Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Achal.
Thank you, Goldman, for hosting.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.